Coming up on Arirang News, world leaders taking part in the P4G Seoul Summit, led by President Moon Jae-in, will soon release the Seoul Declaration, a statement of their determination to take action on climate change and achieve carbon neutrality. South Korea raises its vaccine target by 1 million doses. The goal for the end of next month is to have given doses to 14 million people, thanks to the vaccines to be delivered by the United States. And South Korea's industrial production was down in April by 1.1%, the decline led by the semiconductor industry. But there's a recovery in the retail sector, optimism at the highest level on record. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. It's the second and final day of the P4G Seoul Summit. More than 60 global leaders and heads of international organizations are taking part to coordinate their efforts against climate change. This evening, President Moon Jae-in will chair the Leaders Dialogue Forum, where participants will hold live discussions about the green recovery, carbon neutrality, and public-private partnerships. Among the speakers are the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, and IMF Chief Kristalina Georgieva. The event will then conclude with the adoption of the Seoul Declaration, which will likely urge global efforts to overcome COVID-19 and the climate crisis and to implement the Paris Climate Accord. The P4G Seoul Summit is the second of its kind, the inaugural meeting having taken place in Denmark in 2018. The next summit will be hosted by Colombia. South Korea's industrial output declined last month after 2 straight months of gains. That decline was led by the semiconductor industry. But consumer spending increased, and data show retailers are more optimistic about business going forward than ever before. Min Soo-kyun reports.
South Korea's overall industry production in April saw its sharpest decline in 11 months. According to Statistics Korea on Monday, industrial output dipped 1.1% in April from the previous month. That follows gains of 2% in February and 0.9% in March. The drop in output in April comes as production in the manufacturing sector slumped following a steep fall in the chip-making industry. Semiconductor production fell almost 11% in April from the previous month, largely due to a high base effect following 5 months of strong performances. But production in the service sector remained strong in April, rising for the 3rd straight month. Service output rose 0.4% on month, led by improvements in the accommodation and food service industries. Consumption also grew for the 2nd consecutive month in April. Retail sales, a barometer of consumer demand, increased 2.3% from a month earlier. The retail sales index climbed to 120.5 in April, the highest since data was first compiled by the agency in 1995. The rise was attributed to several factors.
The progress in the vaccine rollout and the warm weather have led to more outdoor activities. Also, the vaccine rollout has helped improve consumer sentiment.
Facility investment gained 3.5% on month in April after staying flat the previous month. Overall, despite a fall in manufacturing output, Statistics Korea expects the momentum for economic recovery to continue as the service output and retail sales posted robust growth. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
Hyundai Motor and its affiliate Kia Motors have seen their exports of eco-friendly cars surge this year. According to the Korea Automobile Manufacturers Association, from January to April this year, they exported more than 118,000 units, an increase of almost 47% on year. Hyundai shipped more than 65,000 units, a rise of 45%, and Kia 52,000 units, up more than 47%. They attributed that to their new plug-in hybrid models. Now, our Seo Eun-kyung has a look ahead at some economic data to come out this week. South Korea will have figures on its exports and imports for the month of May. That'll likely see a big increase in exports. And in the U.S., the Fed will release its monthly beige book showing the extent of the economic recovery now that half of American adults are vaccinated.
The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy will release the export and import figures for May on Tuesday. Preliminary data from the Korea Customs Service showed The trade volume between May 1st and 10th in the country saw a surge compared to the same period last year. Exports soared close to 81% and imports climbed over 51%, indicating an economic rebound for both the domestic and the global markets. Compared to the same period last year, exports of automobiles, automobile parts, and petroleum products largely contributed to the sharp increase. In terms of imports, crude oil and automobiles were the major contributors to the rise. Statistics Korea on Wednesday is set to release the Consumer Price Index for May. The data for April showed the biggest increase in almost 4 years. That came largely on the back of price increases of nearly 13% for agricultural, livestock, and fisheries products, following the poor harvest and rising global oil prices. When it comes to the May figure, the agency said it expects a continuous rise for the time being, mainly because both global and domestic economies are picking up from coronavirus-led recessions. On the same day, the Federal Reserve will release its Beige Book. The latest report said that the U.S. economy accelerated at a moderate pace from late February to early April, backed by increased COVID-19 vaccinations and strong fiscal support. The improving labor market was also said to be a major factor. Released 8 times throughout the year, the Beige Book surveys the current economic conditions across the 12 Federal Reserve districts. The Beige Book will be used as a basis for the Fed's next policy discussion on June 15th to 16th. 서은경, 아리랑 뉴스.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, good to have you back on. Thanks for making time today.
Happy to be here.
Well, last month we saw inflation in the U.S. rise to above 4%. The Fed still saying, though, clearly that it's going to stick with monetary easing. But some in the market aren't so sure about that. They think conditions could force the Fed to start tapering its bond buying sooner. What do you make of the situation, Professor?
Okay, well, the U.S. personal consumption expenditure price indices for April came out last week. The reason that this personal consumption expenditure price indices are so important, perhaps even more than the consumer price index, is that this is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. So this is what the Fed sees when it tries to determine whether the economy is overheating or not. And if you look at the April figures, looking at 12-month change, the personal consumption expenditure price index rose by 36%, and for the core, which excludes food and energy prices, it rose by 3.1%, which is a considerable increase from March, which was 2.4% for overall, 1.9% for the core. Now, the core was expected to rise by 2.9%, so this has caught analysts somewhat by surprise, but perhaps not as much because the consumer price index inflation caught people in a surprise as well. But this number may be misleading because part of the high growth is that you're measuring changes over 12 months. And 12 months ago, it was March and April 2020 when the coronavirus first hit the global economy. So in the U.S., they had a deflation for March and April, minus 0.2% and minus 0.5%. But if you look at the monthly figures, the price increase for each month, just month to month, is increasing from January to April. It was 0.3% in January, but it has steadily risen to 0.6%. And most of the changes in prices have taken place through durable goods rather than non-durable goods. Services have risen somewhat as well, but still, durable goods have risen 1.4% month to month in April, and this is causing great worries among some analysts. Now, there has been some speculation on whether the Fed will raise the interest rates, but nearly half the year is over already, and right now the consensus seems to be that the Fed has promised that they will not raise the rates this year, and they'll do everything they can to raise, to keep that promise of not raising the interest rates. But tapering is still fair game. They never promised that they will not stop or slow tapering this year. They only said that they will give ample signal when they start to slow down tapering or stop tapering. And when the minutes of the April 27th, 28th Fed meeting was revealed earlier last week, they did mention that they're putting the possibility of tapering earlier than planned, sometime within this year, on the table. So tapering is certainly possible, but because they said that they will give ample warning, they will probably not taper in the third quarter. If they are going to start tapering this year, it'll probably be in the fourth quarter.
Right, got it. We'll have to keep our eyes on that, and of course we will. And Professor, let's turn to the market. Stocks on Wall Street ended higher last week. Right now, the S&P is sitting right where it was about a month ago. The U.S. markets will be closed, of course, on Monday for Memorial Day, but catch us up on the global markets as we start the week. Okay,
well, for the week, the S&P rose by 1.1%, Dow's up 0.9%, NASDAQ by 2.1%. This is the fourth month that the Dow and S&P rose, but NASDAQ for the month fell slightly. This is the first negative month that they had in 7 months. Even though the higher inflation figures were revealed last week and the week before, the market seemed to have sort of taken it in stride, especially when the high personal consumption expenditure inflation figures were revealed. That's probably because the market, after seeing the surprise on the CPI inflation, considered it, and it's in the expectations of the market already. For the European markets, CAC and DAX rose last week, but FTSE was level. Asia, Nikkei was up last week, but down today. Shanghai was roughly level since Thursday. Hang Seng was up last week, but down today.
Well, here in Korea, of course, it's the last trading day of the month of May, and today the market seemed to lack direction earlier in the session, but then both the Kospi and the Kosdaq closed higher by almost 0.5%. Tell us about the local markets.
Okay, well, as you mentioned, Kospi was fluttering around losses and gains until 2 p.m. when they started to really rally at the end of the day. It ended today at 3,200, 3.92. This is the first time in 20 days that the market ended above 3,200. Foreigners and individuals bought and institutions sold. Kosdaq was in the gain territory all day long, but it did lose a little bit of momentum toward the end. It ended today at 981.78. Again, foreigners and individuals bought, institutions sold. Now, the April production numbers, they showed that semiconductor production fell substantially. That was a bit of a surprise because exports for semiconductors in April and May increased, and the fall in semiconductor production numbers in April were cut, I think, people by a bit of a surprise. But strangely enough, Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix stock prices rose today.
Interesting indeed. All right, Professor, we're up against the clock. We'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. We always appreciate it.
Thank you.
The South Korean health authorities say that by the end of June, they should be able to have given first vaccine doses to 14 million people, an increase of 1 million from earlier projections. That's thanks to the million extra doses to be sent later this week by the United States. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
South Korea is inching closer to its goal of inoculating at least 70% of the population to reach herd immunity from the coronavirus. Health authorities on Monday said they have raised the country's COVID-19 inoculation target for the first half of this year from the initial 13 million to 14 million, which is some 27% of the population. The increase is mainly due to Johnson & Johnson's Janssen vaccines, which Korea is receiving from the U.S., following U.S. President Joe Biden's pledge to donate vaccines for Korean troops during a meeting with President Moon Jae-in earlier this month.
Starting Tuesday, reservations will begin for more than 1 million doses of the Janssen vaccine provided by the U.S. following the South Korea-U.S. summit. In accordance with the agreement between the two countries, the vaccines are to be administered to military-related personnel.
The Janssen vaccines are to arrive in Seoul on a South Korean military aircraft this Saturday. Those eligible to receive the shots include reservists, members of the civil defense, and those related to the country's defense and foreign affairs over the age of 30. Reservations for the Janssen vaccine start Tuesday, with the actual inoculation taking place between June 10th and 20th. As of Monday, more than 5.4 million people in Korea have received COVID-19 vaccines, which accounts for around 10.5% of the country's population. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
And with South Korea's vaccination campaign in full swing, the distancing rules are going to be eased to some degree for people who've gotten at least one dose. And for the fully vaccinated, they'll be eased to an even greater extent. That starts tomorrow, June 1st. So far, around 10.5% of the population have gotten their first dose. Han Sung-woo has the details.
From June 1st, people in South Korea who've had their first dose of the vaccine for COVID-19 can meet up for gatherings of immediate family members beyond the current limit of 8 people. That means if 5 people in a family have received their first doses, the family could hold gatherings of up to 13 people. For the exemption to apply, at least 2 weeks must have passed since inoculation. Also beginning in June are face-to-face meetings between nursing home residents and visitors if at least one side is fully vaccinated with 2 doses. Visits have to be reserved in advance, though, and eating and drinking together still won't be allowed. Senior welfare centers are easing their restrictions as well.
With masks worn, senior welfare centers will start operating art and computer programs for the elderly who've been vaccinated. Those who've received both doses can participate in singing lessons and wind instrument classes.
And those working at high-risk facilities like nursing homes, mental hospitals, and preschools are to be exempt from regular preemptive testing once they've been completely vaccinated. The government is also offering more incentives to encourage people to get their shots. These include admission fee discounts for national parks, concert halls, and even temple stays. Perhaps the biggest incentive, though, is being able to take off their masks. In July, those who've received their first doses can go outdoors without masks and will be exempt from capacity limits at religious facilities. 2-dose recipients can participate in choirs and are exempt from the 4-person limit on private gatherings. Authorities believe the benefits are translating into better public sentiment towards vaccination. According to a survey conducted in late May, close to 70% of those not vaccinated wish to get the vaccine, rising by about 8 percentage points from April. This comes as 5.4 million people, or 10.5% of the country's population, have been given their first doses. As of Monday afternoon, the reservation rate for the AstraZeneca vaccine among those aged 60 to 74 stood at just under 69%. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
The number of new coronavirus cases in South Korea today was in the 400s for a second day in a row. That's lower than the recent average, in part because of fewer tests being done over the weekend, though. According to the KDCA, there were 430 new cases and there were 2 additional deaths. That raises the death toll to 1,959. Again, 5.4 million people having gotten their first doses. That puts us within range of the government's goal of inoculating a quarter of the country by the end of June. The government says it'll continue to monitor progress toward that goal and adjust the distancing rules as needed this summer. North Korea is criticizing the United States for having lifted the missile guidelines on South Korea, which will allow Seoul to develop and possess longer-range missiles. It's also ripped into the Biden administration's recently revealed North Korea policy. This was in an article published by the regime's state media and is its first such statement since the South Korea-U.S. summit earlier this month. Kim Dami reports.
North Korea has slammed the United States for lifting its missile guidelines on South Korea, calling it a stark reminder of Washington's hostile policy toward the regime and what it called shameful double-dealing. It marks the regime's first response to the pledge by the leaders of Seoul and Washington to use diplomacy to resolve the nuclear standoff with the North.
The North likely wanted to tone down the criticism by releasing it as an article rather than in an official capacity, leaving the potential for diplomacy going forward.
The article was published under an individual's name in the North Korea media on Monday, and it said Pyongyang would face Washington on the basis of an eye for an eye. The backlash comes after the leaders of South Korea and the U.S. terminated the missile guidelines during their first summit earlier this month. Before that, the allies had increased the range and weight of missiles that the South Korean military can develop in response to the North's missile threats.
The criticism is toned down, so it seems that while the North is ready for a tug of war externally, it will also prepare for talks with the U.S. behind the scenes.
Also, observers suggest that the North's less than swift reaction, coming more than a week after the Moon-Biden summit, could mean that the regime is choosing a more careful approach to Pyongyang-Washington relations. They also say that the South Korea-U.S. joint military drill scheduled for August could be a hurdle to a resumption of dialogue. While these irregular exercises could be scaled down like they were last time due to the pandemic, but still, experts say the North will still object to the drills. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
Arirang TV will now have footage from CCTV cameras set up in key spots around the country that'll provide footage in case of severe weather and related disasters. That'll help us provide up-to-the-minute information for the country's English-speaking foreign residents. Our Kim Do-yeon has the details.
Heavy rain, freezing blizzards, and strong winds from typhoons. South Korea's weather can occasionally turn dangerous. To help keep English speakers in South Korea aware of storms and other natural disasters, Arirang TV will from June be able to show live footage from closed-circuit cameras across the country.
We've established a system to broadcast weather for foreigners living in South Korea by connecting to CCTV for disaster monitoring. It took 7 months to prepare, and development took 2 months.
With the click of a few buttons, the 24-hour monitoring software will project selected locations into the studio. Live footage comes from 35 spots across the country, from South Korea's southernmost island, Mara-do, to Ulleung-do in the middle of the East Sea. 13 cameras are located within urban areas, 2 of them are in mountain valleys, 5 of them monitoring rivers, and 15 at coastal areas such as beaches and ports. Of course, this is especially good news for Arirang TV's weathercaster.
I've always wished there were better ways to deliver the reports other than just temperatures, numbers, and words. But now, with Arirang's disaster CCTV broadcasting system, we can present accurate and more reliable weather and information to international community. And lastly,
this is not the first attempt by Arirang TV to update viewers on natural disasters. It has already been continuously developing and carrying out disaster broadcasting systems, establishing the English Disaster Broadcasting Online System in 2019, and the English Disaster Broadcasting Radio Text-to-Speech and Mobile Disaster Information System in 2020. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The city of Seoul last year recorded its lowest smoking rate on record, and the city plans to work on bringing it down even more. According to a survey released by the city on Monday, which is World No Tobacco Day, among men in Seoul, the smoking rate was 28.9%, the first time it's ever been found to be under 30%. The smoking rate among women was 15.5%, which is also the lowest on record. The city's decided to become a partner in the Bloomberg Initiative to Reduce Tobacco Use, a framework that has about 50 cities around the world as members. With a grant from Bloomberg, Seoul will work with the World Health Organization to regulate cigarette advertisements that encourage smoking. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.